Hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides. I'm your host, Jed Brown, founder of Low Season Traveller, and this episode was taken from the 7th session of the Keeping the Dream Alive series of webinars, which we're collaborating on with the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage and My Travel Research. This 7th episode is entitled Aviation in Crisis. It's fair to say that for the most part, tourism starts with airlift. While many of us are not directly involved in aviation, we're all too aware that our livelihoods depend on it. Put simply, whatever happens in aviation will affect the rest of the travel and tourism ecostructure further downstream. As such, this morning's speaker is going to help us to understand exactly how aviation has been affected and what it will take to recover to previous levels. And there's literally no one better to help us unpick this than today's keynote speaker, John Grant of Midas Aviation. John has worked at the cutting edge of aviation for over 30 years, having spent time with KLM, OAG, ASM and latterly with Midas Aviation. He's a hugely well-respected veteran of the industry, regularly provides commentary on the industry for media such as Sky, BBC and others, and he thought he'd seen it all until we hit March this year. Today, John works with airports, tourism boards, airlines and a variety of other partners in order to help them to attract, retain and grow their air services. We used to call it route development, but perhaps now it's known as route protection.
I thought I'd start by posing an interesting question for all of you really, is have we been working in a market that was growing too quickly? I pulled some data back from 1996, and since then the number of scheduled flights operated has more than doubled. And since 2015 alone, which is only a 4.5 year period, we've seen the number of global seats increase by 25%, primarily off a rapid growth in use of aircraft such as the 737 and the A320 series. Particularly in the context of their expanded range through new generation aircraft. And, you know, we were this summer about to see airlines seriously considering transatlantic non-stop regular scheduled services on A320s and 737s. Indeed, WestJet have been doing or were flying from Halifax to London Gatwick using that aircraft type. But we've not only seen an increase in capacity, we've seen some 35,000 airport pairs were operated in 2019. So one of the great benefits of aviation, as we all know, is its brilliant ability to connect various locations around the world directly. And it's now probably possible to travel from any one place in the world to another point in the world with perhaps just one or at maximum two connections required. So, you know, the phrase "the world is shrinking" is absolutely true. But the question I pose is, had we reached a point where this industry was actually in need of a reset? And if you look on the far right hand side here, the last 3 or 4 years, we have seen rates of growth that have been some of the highest in the last 15 years. Not only have we seen growth in Asia through emergent airlines, the burgeoning Chinese international services, part of a grand master plan from the Chinese airlines to fly to as many destinations as possible. And indeed, I think at one point there was something like 7 or 8 airlines operating from just 1 or 2 markets in China to Melbourne and Sydney. So lots of very fierce competition, but perhaps surprisingly growth in markets that we would have expected to have been quite mature. Rapid growth in the transatlantic market, where we've seen the emergence of long-haul low-cost with carriers such as Norwegian and Level. Obviously, Norwegian's 787 fleet is now grounded and will remain grounded for a indefinite period, at least until 2021. And also in the US domestic market, where suddenly we don't have low-cost carriers, we have ultra low-cost carriers with airlines such as Spirit, Frontier and Allegiant, who've stimulated more capacity and more growth in the market. And interestingly, We'd also begun to see some of the US legacy airlines with their new fleets expanding seasonal summer flying to Europe and to Latin America as opportunities came along. But was it sustainable? Was this a bubble that we had created on our own that would have burst anyway? And perhaps COVID-19 is a reset moment in time that was going to happen anyway in the aviation industry, and one that we very much needed. And as to why we needed that, well, airline profitability had never been so good. If you look at this data here on the left-hand side, you'll see that for the last 10 years, the airline industry has, at the top level, been extremely profitable. Levels of profit that we've not seen before, returns on capital that we're beginning to be considered as reasonable. But this was the golden moment in an aviation industry that's 100 years old. And it had taken us 90 years to learn the lessons of our business before we actually became quite profitable. But nearly all of that profitability was generated by what I describe as a cluster of airlines. United, American, Delta, and Southwest in North America, the IAG group in Europe, Lufthansa to a lesser degree, Air France and KLM, and then of course Ryanair and EasyJet. And for those in Asia, airlines such as Qantas, Singapore, and Cathay Pacific. Interestingly, no mention there of any Chinese airlines who perhaps have not been as profitable as they would have hoped, particularly on their new long-haul services. Indeed, no new long-haul international service launched by a Chinese airline in the last 5 years has ever made an operating profit. I describe it as land grabbing as they seek to secure traffic rights and licenses from the Chinese authorities for city pairs that have little chance of being profitable or realistically profitable in the next decade. And only 2 airlines in Africa actually are profitable, Ethiopian and Comair. And Comair, unfortunately, have just had to, in the last couple of weeks, file for protection as their cash reserves had run out. So this is an industry that, whilst profitable and at headline numbers, and as some journalists will frequently say, it's extremely profitable. Yes, it is extremely profitable for a very small community. There are 723 airlines that are sending scheduled services on a weekly basis to OAG. Less than 40, perhaps 50 at most, are consistently profitable over that period of time. And that's based on an operating profit. So that's excluding any types of commercial deals around aircraft sale and lease back, etc. So it's a very fragile community that we live in, and it's very challenging for any airline to make money. So as I say, too much of a good thing. 730 airlines, 10% profitable over an economic cycle. So that's typically an 8 to a 10-year period. The industry has perhaps too much fragmentation. Consolidation was frequently blocked. It's very hard to find an industry of such global scale and size where larger conglomerates have not been established, and this is potentially in most cases down to bilateral issues, state protection, down to cautious strategic thinking around allowing a foreign entity to own a majority share of a carrier in another country. So what we've actually seen is creative ways around this, equity shares in businesses. So Qatar Airways have done a very good job of acquiring shares in carriers around the world. Delta Airlines from the United States have similarly acquired stock in partners around the world, and of course most recently did were usurped at the last moment in South America, where American pulled the rug from under their feet with a new deal with LATAM. So we have too much choice, too much capacity, too many airlines, too little profit. And then suddenly the industry fell perhaps off a cliff, and the view was not particularly good. The 22nd of March will be remembered as a special day in aviation. If it's your birthday on that date, congratulations. But for most of us in the airline industry, it was the beginning of a nightmare. In some 2 weeks, 41 million seats were removed from sale by airlines around the world. 1 week later, 52 million seats had been lost. Over half of the weekly global capacity supplied in the world had disappeared in the space of 3 weeks. We reached a low point around the 4th of May when just under 30 million seats a week were being operated or scheduled to operate. And I say scheduled because, as you'll see later, there was numerous cancellations, some of the highest rates of cancellation that's ever seen in the airline industry during that period. Yeah, so we'd lost 52 million seats, which was pretty dramatic. The low point was below 30 million seats a week. It's very good to see both China and US domestic markets remaining relatively strong in terms of capacity, because they literally kept the market afloat on their own. And I've never witnessed such a dramatic supply wipeout as we saw in that short period of time. It was unprecedented. It's probably not the first time I'll use that word today, but it was the biggest single wipeout I have seen. And perhaps the most significant thing about this was it was on a global basis. This was not a regional issue. This was across all regions of the world, whereas in events such as SARS, in events such as MERS and Ebola, we've seen very specific regions impacted. This was a global incident, and everywhere was affected. And just to highlight that, here is some data from OAG, who we do a number of weekly webinars for them, and you can see these are a series of 4 heat maps ranging from the 16th of March through to the 11th of May, and you can see the intensity of the red shaping across those 4 heat maps to a point by the 11th of May last week where 86% of the world's capacity was not operating compared to the same week last year. And there were numerous countries with complete 100% lockdowns on nearly every continent. So, you know, there were some lockdowns occurring in Australia and New Zealand, and talk, of course, about bubbles and corridors and other such creative terminology to reignite air services. We had lockdowns in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is completely locked down at this moment in time. There are no flights. India was locked down and came out of lockdown last Friday, and then went back into lockdown again on Monday of this week. So, you know, that highlights some of the vulnerability of restarting air services and the issues we have to face as an industry. Countries in Europe continue to be in lockdown. South Africa is in lockdown. Peru is in lockdown. There are countries completely isolating themselves from air services at this moment in time. So you can see the spread of the COVID-19 event across the globe. And then moving on. So there are 720 airlines, as I said, that were filing schedules, operating services on the 20th of January of this year. And now we have somewhere around 230 scheduled airlines who are no longer flying and have suspended services. Some of those will return, undoubtedly. EasyJet Saudi and Turkish Airlines all have schedules loaded and expect to start flying again. Some will return, but perhaps shouldn't. Some of you, I'm sure, have been following the tragedy of South African Airways over the last couple of months, whilst I'm sure all of you are very much aware of Alitalia and the constant resuscitation attempts of Alitalia, who once again are now back in state ownership, when perhaps, given how fierce the Italian market is, they would perhaps be better to be allowed to gracefully exit the market and leave it to others who are able to serve it more effectively and more efficiently. And on the left-hand side here, some friends of ours at a company called Ishka, who are specialists in aviation and aircraft valuations, developed a slide that shows the financial risk profile of airlines against the willingness and the desire of the government stroke shareholders and investors to support those airlines through a COVID-19 event. And as you can see, and as you move across to the top right hand corner of this chart, there are a number of airlines that are in a red box that were identified very early on in this process and in this event as potential candidates at risk. Airlines that either didn't have great cash reserves, or for which there would be little appetite for whatever reasons, be they competition or for just literally strategic government purposes, that there would be little or no support. And I think it's quite interesting on reflection, 18 weeks into this event, that when you look at this table, you see carriers such as Avianca, who are now in Chapter 11, Virgin Atlantic, who are desperately seeking support from their shareholders and have been to the UK government seeking support. Virgin Australia, who I think have 7 or 8 interested parties in refinancing the entity and starting to operate again in a robust manner and provide some competition for Qantas. And South African Airways, who have, as I said, filed Chapter 11. A colleague of mine actually described it as Chapter 88 because they've been in this space 8 times and they've still not sorted out their problems. And then other carriers slightly more to the left, such as Norwegian, who, as we know, have now sought and secured agreement to operate with just 7 Boeing 737s for the rest of 2020 and into early 2021. And this was an airline that was one of the fastest growing and most successful carriers in terms of growth and passengers carried in the last 5 years. And then carriers such as El Al over here, who yesterday announced or raised the question whether they actually had a sustainable business after this moment in time, and would they be able to survive. So it gives you an idea of where you are, and if any of these are any of your customers on your suppliers, you know, it's good to know that if you're in the bottom left hand corner, those carriers are quite well protected. The further out you go, of course, the greater the risk becomes. So if I refer to just, you know, a couple of these carriers as we go forward, you'll see the challenges that they have as they try to grow out from this situation. So looking at bailouts, support, investment and rescue, it is quite interesting to look and see how much government support everyone has provided from their respective authorities towards their national airlines. And very early on, Singapore Airlines, as you can see here, through the Singapore government, secured access to a new financing package. Now, it's important to caveat this information with the knowledge that each and every one of these commercial agreements, each and every one of these loan guarantees, financing and repackaging is very, very different, because as you would appreciate, some are just loan guarantees, some are direct investment, and some are refinancing. So no two deals are the same. But if you look on the vertical axis, you can see the amount of funding that was requested or has been approved. So in the case of Singapore Airlines, nearly $14 billion of funding or access to funds as required. And then if you look here, you can see United, Delta, and American, and you compare that to the amount of seats. So you can see that on a per seat basis operated, the relative support provided to carriers such as American and Delta Airlines and United is quite small. And then you look at the amount of revenue per seat that has been given to Singapore Airlines, very, very much larger. So moving on to this slide here, which looks at some of the messaging that we've seen from IATA in the last couple of weeks. I think this is fascinating. I remember going to do a BBC news interview on the 5th of March to discuss an industry expected revenue loss of 63 billion at the bottom end of a spectrum, and I think it was 113 was their mid-range expectation, and everyone was in shock about how large these numbers could be. Within 3 weeks, IATA were forecasting a 252 billion revenue loss for the industry. By the 7th of April, they were saying 25 million jobs were at risk. By the 14th of April, the industry's trade association was expecting a loss of about $314 billion. And then a week later, IATA put out a press release saying that the industry was going to have to refund in the region of $10 billion to passengers, which may explain both why there has been a reluctance in some parts of the world for those refunds to be processed, or to be processed as quickly as perhaps the traveller would want, and at the same time why it has been, the airline's preference to offer vouchers that could be considered for travel in the next 12 months. To give you an insight into that, every refund that is undertaken by an airline takes around 15 minutes for a very simple point-to-point refund to be processed. So for a very simple ticket. But if they're refunding a ticket that has been half used, they have to calculate how much is actually owed back to the passenger. They have to net off the taxes and the airport fees and the charges. And if it involves a routing with another airline, then that's an even more complex refund. So a classic interline ticket would take a lot longer than 15 minutes to be processed. Airlines were never set up to refund volumes to the scale that they are now being asked to do. And airlines are in the same position as many other businesses in that they have furloughed staff, they have had to cut back their resources, and therefore they are struggling to just keep up to pace with the amount of refunds. There is one airline, just as an example, in the United Kingdom, where although they are obliged to refund to travel agents within 14 working days, it's taking them up to 100 days at the moment to refund that cash. So on that basis, we just have this horrible sticky situation, which of course brings more doubt and question to the whole industry in the minds of the consumer. But this is just the revenue side, and of course from the airline perspective, there's also the cost side. And a major part of that, as we've known for many years, has been about the price of oil, and particularly how vulnerable airlines are to significant swings in the price of oil. Now, one of the good things for many people in the whole COVID-19 event has been the significant fall in the price of oil. But it's proving to be a very slippery slope for many airlines. As you may be aware, it's quite customary for airlines to hedge their fuel price, so essentially buy forward at an agreed price for an agreed volume of oil from suppliers around the world. And that obviously gives, in normal times, the airlines reassurance that they can work through and plan with one of their major cost items fixed. Unfortunately, the price of oil has collapsed from about $80 a barrel, $88 a barrel in January, down to, at the moment, around $33, $34 a barrel. But many airlines have hedged at prices ranging from about 89 in the case of EasyJet, down to 63, 64 with Lufthansa, and large proportions of their anticipated fuel supplies is locked in at these prices for the rest of this year, and in one case through into 2021. From the recent quarterly reports we've seen from airlines, we know that for the IAG group, so British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus, and Vueling, that fuel hedge cost them $300 million in the first quarter of this year. So if they had purchased at the market price as opposed to what was their hedge price, they would have saved $300 million. Ryanair use a phrase called an ineffective hedge, and announced yesterday that that had cost them $382 million US. Singapore Airlines on last Friday announced that their fuel hedge had cost them $498 million. The collapse of global trade, the glut of oil, has created a double whammy for many airlines, committed to purchasing fuel that they're not using at a price that is significantly above the market level. It's created a situation where cash continues to drain from these businesses with no solution and no way of recovering that situation. The good news is that we seem to have reached the bottom. If I look at the weekly capacity trend through to the end of November, you can see that we had a very, very rapid decline in capacity over that 4-week, 5-week period. And we've been bumping along here. This slight increase in capacity here is a function of the Chinese domestic market and more capacity being added back up. But the real problem now is the shaded yellow area. And how do we get out from COVID-19? This, for the industry, represents a real challenge and a real problem. This savage reduction in capacity, whilst extremely expensive, damaging, impactful, was immediate. This poses a much longer term issue and problem that we need to address as an industry. Very bluntly, it was easy to dive in, but it's very difficult to crawl back out. Adding back capacity is going to be very challenging for all airlines around the globe. Reopening schedules generally requires a booking lead time. If you think about any new route, any airline that has announced a new service, they will at the minimum be announcing that service perhaps 3 to 5 months before the first scheduled service takes off. Many airlines are trying to build back capacity with less than 2 or 3 weeks notice. Current forward bookings in their reservation systems are almost non-existent. Less than 20% of the previous year's levels for most months of this summer season. And if you think about when COVID-19 started, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, January, February, March, and April are 3 of the most important booking months for the holiday season.
As I say, this slide shows Wizz Air's ambitious plans for air service that they launched in early May. They put back in 400,000 seats a week, very brave, very early, preemptive, before much of Europe was out of lockdown. Most travellers still didn't know about what travel requirements and processes they would need to fulfil to be able to sit on an aircraft. But in the first week of service, they cancelled nearly 90% of those flights because there was just no demand, because people were struggling to work their way through the processes and understand what was required of them to travel. And consequently, you can see that a week later, they had cut their network, their planned number of flights, to around 180 a week, whereas previously they had been planning to operate 600 plus flights a week. So there is a real danger as we come out of this event around the whole rebuild and matching capacity to demand. It's going to be a challenge for many. And to that point, these recovery strategies that we see from the airlines have to be based around building and aligning demand with capacity. So here's an example of some analysis that we've undertaken that compares the number of bookings currently held in the GDS systems by major airlines and by country markets against the amount of seats that are still planned to be operated in July of 2020. And essentially what we're trying to determine here is, are we likely to see more cancellations from airlines? Are we going to see further adjustments to their schedules in the coming weeks ahead of July 2020 as they begin to balance capacity against demand and booking activity? Now, in every market, with a notable exception of Hong Kong, Japan, we tracked both capacity change and booking change. And essentially, if you are below this yellow line here, and you are in this area here, there is more capacity relative to booking activity than there was this time last year. So all of these markets that you see here are likely to see capacity being cut by airlines in the next couple of weeks as they begin to focus on July and fixing their schedules relative to demand. Now, obviously, many parts of the world are still in lockdown, and until that central issue is resolved, big announcements from Lufthansa about we are flying again in June of this year, big announcements from Delta that they're going to add 100 international flights, are worthy sentiments, but it's going to be really difficult for people to book, and we should expect to see short-term cancellations in many markets as we work our way through the summer season towards the end of October. Which brings me on to, what do we need? Well, we need, I think, what we call the 3 C's to recovery. We need clarity. One of the great frustrations is a lack of direction from government agencies and trade associations Airlines are looking for leadership to understand what processes they need to adhere to. Airports are looking to understand from health authorities what requirements they have to be adhering to and putting in place. And we understand it's not going to be until the end of May before ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, publish their definitive guidelines on what steps and processes need to be put in place on a global basis. Some of you may have seen governments backtracking on travel requirements. We have a wonderful example in the United Kingdom where we were advised informally, I mean informally by the government, that there would be a quarantine process put in place at some point for travellers returning to the UK. There isn't one now, but it will be put in place. That doesn't make sense in itself. But we were told that France would be excluded from that quarantine zone. We've subsequently been told that France will be included in that quarantine zone. For an airline trying to run a business and rebuild a business, that confusion creates all sorts of uncertainty. We don't need cheap photo shots of people on arrival being tested for COVID-19. You know, pictures of 10 people in a vast hall, all socially distancing and being tested are great, but the reality is that, you know, we cannot just process 10 people. Airports process thousands of people. We also need to rebuild confidence. There's been so much hysteria about the middle seat and keeping it free. It is only 17 inches wide, that middle seat, on most aircraft types and seating configurations. If it's empty or it's full, then I think, you know, it just defeats the whole argument of social distancing. Truth is, we will not require that seat for quite some time on the vast majority of flights because demand will be quite low. And we need to begin to highlight the positive messages about forward booking demands, growth, new routes being started, capacity being added back, etc. So we've got to rebuild confidence in the whole travel community. And then I think we've got to be cautious as well about capacity. Too much capacity too quickly could be extremely damaging. Rapid capacity rebuild will absolutely impact yields. There is a big difference between creating and stimulating markets and having too much capacity in a market. Airlines will stimulate markets when they begin to fly again. They will put some very attractive fares in the market. They need to build cash again. It's important for them. But too much capacity too quickly will just undermine many, particularly when we have some airlines that have received state aid and benefits and support and others who have not. We have created a very uneven playing field from a competition perspective. And the last thing we need to see is those airlines that received significant support and funding using that cash as a way to stimulate and develop new business, but at the same time put below cost pricing into the market. So when will the industry recover? Well, it might never, if you believe some people. They'll tell you that traveller confidence has been completely shattered. There are alternate modes of transport which are becoming more acceptable to some, such as high-speed train, and we have evidence in China that would say over the last public holiday there was greater use of high-speed train and private cars rather than air services. So that might be something we need to consider. There is a fear of being stranded in another COVID event amongst some communities. For some people, of course, who've been furloughed or made redundant, their savings have been destroyed in the last 3 months, and they're now looking at rebuilding those before travel is even on their agenda. And of course, video conferencing, except today, meets my and most people's business needs. There's equally a group that say until there is a vaccine, I'm staying at home. Or there are others who say I want to see more of the world, I've missed it. Flying will be cheaper and safer than ever. A colleague of mine said the safest place in the world at the moment is an airport because there is no one there. And that's very true. People who have been in a fortunate position can say they've spent very little being stuck at home, so they're going to splash the cash. Others will say, I need to catch up with my friends who I've been videoing with regularly. And for some businesses, they may well say there's lots of opportunity out there. Everything is possible in the new normal. It's the unknown. But for what it's worth, here's some thoughts from me. Global capacity will probably have recovered to around 60% of its previous levels by January 21. So the beginning of next year. But load factors will be between 15 and 20% lower on that level of capacity. So we will still be seeing more capacity than there will be demand through to January 21. By summer 21, global capacity will have recovered to around 75% of its previous levels, but we will still have that load factor lag, somewhere between 10 and 15%. And by April of 2022, so 2 years from now, 90% of the COVID capacity, pre-COVID capacity will have returned, but we'll still see load factors lagging behind. And even from April 2022, airline cash reserves will require rebuilding. And that's going to take another 2 to 3 years to reach the point that they were at before. And I think worryingly, some airlines will not make it past February 21. There is no doubt about that. If they cannot build cash reserves this summer and quickly, then the prognosis for some airlines is for failure and collapse in the first quarter of next year. So it's a fascinating experiment that we have lived through in terms of aviation. But we now are in a situation where we need to rebuild.
So there you have it. Huge thanks again to John Grant from Midas Aviation for his insights this week. And if you haven't already done so, do have a listen to the Q&A from this session in the next episode, which is also out now. That's all for now. Enjoy your day, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home, and don't forget that our content will always be free for everyone, as we believe that travel is better without the crowds.